So this is a defense of Andrew Jackson. I had to do it for him. I mean, hey, let's do it.
Andrew Jackson repeatedly shows up in top 10 lists of the great presidents of the United States, both those that are taken from popular audiences and those that are taken from professional historians.
I'm not shocked that he's popular with so-called popular audiences. He is on the $20 bill. And you know what? Some could argue he deserved to be on there because he won New Orleans. He was the only president, like, from Andrew Jackson to, like, Ulysses S. Grant. No president had two terms. All of them were one-term presidents. So that's something amazing about him. He was like the only president to actually pay off all the debt. Now, many people could say it was Congress because after the 1812 election, Congress had like regulations on spending that made it very easy. But here's the thing: you could literally have a surplus and still fuck it up. Just ask about George W. Bush. So that's something you could give towards him.
I'm not convinced that he belongs in these lists, and let me explain why. First, I think the reason he does is because there are certain myths that have grown up around him. For one, he is the champion of the common man. He is a son of...
Well, the common white man, but that was the only people who could actually vote en masse back then.
The frontier. He's a war hero. For another, he's the...
Yeah, I guess you can call him a war hero since in the 1812 war, he won the only like significant battle to like remember from that whole damn war, at least on the American side.
Enemy of the elite. After all, he fought the Second Bank of the United States.
He also fought like John Adams' son, John Q. Adams, who kind of like screwed him out of the election with the whole thing with the House of Representatives and all that. I'm not going to get into it, but he was screwed out of it.
And lastly, he's considered to be a champion of the U.S. Union because he stood against the idea of state nullification of federal law.
Well, I don't know about state nullification of federal law, but he did like stop South Carolina from succeeding after the whole U.S. embargo or U.S. It was something that South Carolina wanted to succeed, and then Jackson, who was one of the only few people to actually show some balls, and I think I forgot what his name is. I think like Zachary Taylor. I think like he showed some balls, said he would hang all of them. You know, the guy who died from like water and like cherries. He showed some balls. But other than them, like Lincoln, he was one of the few presidents that showed some balls against the states. So we have to commend him on that.
But I think there's something more to the Jackson story. The same people who buy into these myths also seem to think of...
Are these myths or just opinions? Like, you know, it's opinions, but I wouldn't call them like myths. Myths would be like Lincoln chopping, well, not Lincoln, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree. That's a myth. But these are more or less like opinions.
His avid personal campaigning for office, for example, or his use of the unofficial kitchen cabinet as an advisory body for his presidency, as just part of...
That's another thing that he has with Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant got a bunch of his friends in office. So did Jackson. But to be fair, a lot of these positions were filled with with John Q. Adams, which he had to replace.
Of sort of trademark, larger-than-life figure that he cut as a leader. I think we need to look more in depth at all of the aspects of Jackson before we determine whether or not he was a great president. First of all, was Jackson a man...
Shouldn't we only look through his like presidency. Like other than the personal stuff, what is relevant is like the 8 years he was in office, right?
The people. Well, he was, in fact, a son of the frontier. He was, in fact, in some ways, a military hero. He did have a scar where he was struck by a British official when he was a young child because he refused to shine the man's boots, these sorts of things. He certainly did.
I like how she doesn't bring up the whole New Orleans thing. He was a military hero because he took a blade as a kid. That's basically it.
Displayed over and over again in his personal life a tremendous individual courage. But he was a war hero.
Yeah, that showed some tremendous courage. I would just shine the shoes. I ain't taking like a scar on my fucking face.
Those who didn't have to go around and clean up the results of his unauthorized activities that he pursued when he was a military man. For example, his invasion of lands that were held by other countries that he wasn't authorized to invade, such as Spanish Florida.
Oh yeah, he gained Florida for the U.S., but you know, hey, now we have Florida. Like my grandmother is in Florida. Thanks, Jackson.
The killing of non-U.S. citizens he wasn't authorized to execute, such as the execution of 2 British citizens during the First Seminole War of 1818.
Well, unless you're British, I guess you would be pissed off. I see she didn't bring up any killings of Indians, but yeah, back then Brits were being hated. I wish she'd go into more detail about the British citizens, though.
Did a number of things as a loose cannon, and the presidents who were in charge of the armies in which he served many times had reason to rue the fact that Jackson was on their side.
They could have fired him, like Harry did that with MacArthur. Now Harry Truman, he did that shit with MacArthur. So they could have just fired him if they had a big problem with him.
The son of the frontier and war hero legend.
And I don't think any American president would be mad that he killed a British citizen. Back then, they hated the Brits. I mean, they hated the Brits so much, they caused a war about it.
Helped him claim the mantle of the champion of the common man. But when we look at the reform...
Common white man, the only people that could vote, like back then, or at least vote en masse.
Efforts that came out of the so-called Jacksonian Revolution, we find they don't have much in common with Jackson, the leader, or Jackson the man. For example, one of the movements that came out of the Jacksonian Revolution was the abolition movement, and Jackson remained to his dying day an unrepentant slave owner.
Yeah, that was by his VP, like Martin Van Buren. He's the one, him and Jackson created the Democrat movement, so I don't know how Jacksonians, like actually, the Democrats were their slave party, but I don't know how Jacksonians were anti-slavery. So, hey, maybe she'll explain.
Another was the women's suffrage movement. And Jackson, even for his time, was really the subscriber to an antiquated, out-of-date cult of masculinity. For example...
Just because he was masculine doesn't mean he was automatically anti-woman or anti-female. I mean, yeah, he had too many muscles, therefore he was sexist.
He, long after it was out of fashion, pursued personal dueling as a means of settling political disputes. The National Bank did...
Oh yeah, he actually killed a person. Like, he took a bullet and then killed a person. And he survived a assassination where somebody pulled out 2 guns and they didn't shoot him. Like, both of them jammed.
Resent an overstepping of federal bounds according to the Constitution, and he justly fought it.
Citation needed, according to the Constitution.
But if we look at the reasons he fought it, there's much to be said that it was a personal conflict. In fact, much of Jackson's political life seems to be tied around personal rivalries, personal likes, and...
Yeah, I don't care if somebody does like the right thing or just a gutsy thing because it was personal. Much of the time, that's like the main motivator why to do the right thing, personal issues.
Dislikes with other people. In this case, Biddle with the bank, Jackson wanted to destroy him. And despite the fact he was going against something that was an overstepping of national authority, he sort of fought a wrong with another wrong.
With the banks, that was overstepping of national authority. I thought the government is the one who issued the right to currency for the banks.
Because he himself stepped over his constitutionally given authority in order to fight the national bank. And so, in a sense,
might makes right, I guess. I mean, the greater wrong turns into a lesser right.
his economic policy came from personal animosity, and it also represented a growth in national government because of the executive power he wielded. His
Oh yeah, well, every president have basically grown the government since the beginning. Like, if you want to be real about it.
position against state nullification is also a difficult one to defend. For one thing, once again, it seemed
Not really. South Carolina wanted to succeed because of tariffs, and Jackson didn't allow them. That's why I respect him.
it's much more about personal animosity. In this case, Jackson going against John C. Calhoun, who left the position of vice president to go back to his home state of South Carolina, the state that pressed the issue with state nullification.
No wonder they wanted to succeed. The guy who's running it was bitter about losing the VP spot.
A federal law. And also, it seemed an action in support of Martin Van Buren, who was Jackson's hand-chosen successor to the presidency.
Well, his second hand-chosen successor.
Also, it's difficult to defend the idea that he was so very pro-union when, at the same time,
I never heard that Jackson was a union hero or something like that. Is she talking about the union as in the 50 states? Oh, okay. I'm dumb. Hold on.
The failure of Jackson to execute the decision of the judiciary in the 1832 Worcester v. Georgia case, his whole argument was that this...
With the whole Indian removal thing, Jackson didn't use federal power to actually enforce like the Supreme Court's ruling. And you know what? His logic was that this was a local issue and it had to be handled locally. So yes, Georgia actually removed the Cherokees. And in fact, I'm living on Cherokee land now. So I guess if he didn't do that, then I wouldn't be living on this land. So not only did he make a home for my grandmother, which is in Florida, he gave me Cherokee land. So hey.
This was Georgia's issue and not the U.S. government's, and so he could not, in fact, step in to defend the Cherokee Nation against the state of Georgia. So in that case, he seemed to be arguing that states had more authority and that he...
Yeah, states have all the authority in the world, just don't leave the Union. That was Jackson's position, basically.
He couldn't get involved as president in a situation where a state was up against national authority. It's not...
I like how she complains that he made the government too big, but yet it wasn't big enough to where he actually could enforce federal law. So pick one side. Either you're mad that he made the government big, or you're mad that he made the government small. Like, pick one side, because he did not want to use federal power to enforce it.
Very consistent in terms of his policy.
Speaking of
Besides
consistency,
which, you could argue that there were some very interesting things about the decentralist vision of Calhoun and the notion of states' rights that totally get missed in the argument for the common purpose.
Calhoun looks like Frankenstein. Like, he looks dead ass like Frankenstein.
person when we consider the idea that Jackson's pro-union stance was somehow a pro-common man stance as well.
Amen.
Jackson's embrace of the spoil system, the idea that he should...
Oh, yeah, this is where he hires all his friends, which is something that he has similar with Ulysses S. Grant. Both of them had 2 terms, so maybe hiring your friend leads to, like, you being successful, or you making it easier on yourself.
Clean house. Once a leader came into office, he could clean house of those who existed before and replace them with his own personal supporters.
Yeah, he had to totally clean house after John Q. Adams, who absolutely he hated and who pretty much stole the election from Jackson.
Is also something that led to the growth of the national government. And certainly, if we think about Jackson's overall...
They called Martin Van Buren a fox because he had red hair and, he was swifty. He was very, I forgot what the word's called.
Policy toward Native America. This is a trend that is not one of any honor for the United States. He began...
Yeah, it pretty much sucked, but you know what? I learned that the Native Americans supported, like, the Confederacy, so, that kind of... And they owned slaves. So that kind of... my sympathy goes down a bit.
A policy of Indian removal, coercive Indian removal, that led to what we could consider today... certainly meets the criteria for, if we use the definition of the United Nations, ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, like you telling me that policies in 1840 did not age well? Like, oh, who would know?
It certainly doesn't sound like something that belongs attached to the name of one of the great presidents.
Oh yeah, look up Lincoln. I mean, this guy Lincoln, he actually had an Indian war. Where he actually, it was one of the biggest federal executions in the world, at least for America. He killed, a whole bunch of Indian people in 1 year. Really, y'all should read into that. Lincoln, he actually... And also, Lincoln, he actually, also did not like Mormons. Wasn't a fan of the Mormons. He actually federally banned, multiple marriages.
The United States. Repeatedly, ever the frontiersman, ever the general, Jackson seemed to act as if might made right. And that
pretty much
does
back
not
then,
lend itself to the idea of a president who was a supporter of personal rights or a supporter of the common man. In fact, he insists...
I'm very interested because might makes right. That seems like some common man logic, whatever the commoner does is correct. If enough forceful people do it, then it's okay. That seems like a common man theme.
That he embodied or personified the will of the people, much in the same way that Louis XIV suggested that he...
I mean, Jackson actually got 100% of Mississippi's votes and Georgia's votes. And she's going to compare him to Louis XIV. They called Abraham Lincoln Africanus the First and called him a king. It was a very common thing to just call presidents kings back then because they literally had kings.
Was the embodiment,
back then, in other countries,
of France, which led Jackson's detractors to call him King Andrew I.
It's like calling somebody a dictator today. There's dictators in other countries.
Of those kinds of reputations, great presidents, I don't think, are made. Recent works in history
Amen.
Show that Jackson was a bit of a loose cannon. He was someone who acted from...
It took recent works, it took 200 years for you all to realize that some guy who killed people in duels was a loose cannon.
Personal passions. He was someone whose greatness was repeatedly brought low by a lack of self-control and self-discipline. Someone...
I would say that killing a man, in a duel, like adds to your lore and greatness. Like that's some manly shit. Especially after you take a bullet and then you shoot back. Like that's some manly shit.
Who was controlling and at the same time uncontrollable. This Jackson was the kind of man who exemplified characteristics later associated with what we call the imperial presidency. Before Abraham Lincoln, he represented selective adherence to the
Amen. Finally, she mentions Abraham. I keep on connecting Abraham Lincoln and Jackson, both of them.
U.S. Constitution. Before William McKinley, he represented energetic imperialism. Before Teddy Roosevelt, he represented a cult of personality. And before Bill Clinton, he represented the personal made political. He was, in short, an imperial president in the making long before imperial president.
I don't know what the personal imperial whatever the hell she said with Bill Clinton. I don't think he had like a cheating affair or anything like that, like Bill Clinton. So I don't think they're connected in any way. He did have a budget. He did have a balanced budget like Bill Clinton. Hell, he had no debt.
Presidents were cool. Consolidating authority in the national executive and treating the letter of the U.S. Constitution as a suggestion rather than a constraint. So perhaps we shouldn't.
Well, it is open to interpretation. So it basically is a suggestion. They should have made it more straight. They should have made it more longer and more straight and added more context to it. So yeah, basically it is a suggestion. But I'm gonna end it right here. Bye.